BOMAC Talk with your virtual tailgate, offering our commentary on industry-specific information relevant to the conversations being held for and by owners, managers, and administrators, conferencing new developments in technology, how technology is impacting our quality of life, and how technology may shape our future. These current conversations has our inspiration, excitement, and drive bouncing off the Richter scale. We're fired up and fueling that fire into something we can use. We have been particularly ignited about the efforts towards smart cities, sustainable buildings, and a societal conscious effort to naturally integrate technology into our daily lives. With that, we like to offer a couple of comments for thought. In the 90s, we attended a conference on sustainable architecture in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In those days, sustainable wasn't such a buzzword of popularity, yet this city had managed to produce quality offices, retail, and residential communities that were, as we call it now, green. So there were tours of these buildings, communities, and lots of discussion about how other cities could implement their strategy. We received lots of information, examples, and the pitch was so convincing. I thought this is the way to go. This is how built work should be. When I track my interest today, the exposure at that conference is really where those initial ideas about green communities came from. Well, who said anything about going green, right? We're talking about smart cities. This commentary takes the position that smart cities utilize sustainable architecture and other types of energy-conscious practices. Going green is smart and dually compatible with smart technologies. We sketched a simplified graph of how we see the landscape of development to smart cities from the status quo and the challenges therein. Let's take a look. So our first graphic shows the grid of the status quo. This is how we build today. This is the standard way of building, just in terms of city infrastructure. And then as we sprawl out, within that circle or out in the outskirts are green communities, sustainable buildings, modifications of that grid. And so there is a transition to try to modify the status quo by inserting single sustainable buildings or building green communities. Then in the outskirts of that, we have alternative methods of construction. We start talking about 3D printing. 3D printing buildings, that's definitely not the standard way of how we build today. I don't even think the International Building Code actually includes anything about how that should be done appropriately. And then proof of concept communities. We talked about a lot at the conferences, as to create these communities where you're kind of testing out the technology and testing out some of the concepts that you're presenting to see how they play out, which ones work and which ones do not. And then in the outskirts from that are rural single family experiments. You can find a lot of these online where individual has a piece of property and they decide to experiment with sustainable building technologies and to build a green single family home or complex. Way in the outskirts is where folks have decided to live off the grid completely. They're going way beyond being in a rural area, which may be made up of small municipalities, but they're going far out where there aren't any governance in the small municipality aspect, and basically going off the grid. And I think this is a transition into log cabins, mud homes, very primitive camping-like living. And I don't think that that's the way to go. I think technology should be very integrated into the idea or transition away from the grid and the status quo. And so I believe these are extreme cases, folks that are doing it, and it's working for them, but I don't think that it's going to work for the general population. And so that's one graphic or one scenario. And this would be particularly, I would think, in the United States and other countries where they have lots of huge cities, and their infrastructure is pretty much, the infrastructure is pretty much in place already. Our next graphic is for places that are, like third world countries or places that are undeveloped. They don't have, they may have some cities that are infrastructure has been built and they're on a grid according to the status quo and the standards of building today. But a majority of that area is underdeveloped. These are places where living off the grid is not on purpose. They didn't do it on purpose, but it's just underdeveloped land, underdeveloped communities, undeveloped culture. And so I think these are prime areas to kind of transition back and do some technology integrations, some proof of concept communities, some community adaptation. It's easier because the grid is more flexible. It's not already built, it's not already adopted, and so you have an opportunity to introduce some other ideas. And transitioning to the grid and the status quo, they can kind of meet halfway, where the existing grids aren't so dominant in that they can't be modified. They cannot begin to use and implement alternative methods of construction, and where they can also use proof of concept communities. So I think that this is kind of the ideal situation in that you can take both the grid and status quo, and then the living off the grid in underdeveloped areas, and kind of meet halfway in utilizing some of the solutions to adapting sustainable buildings, green technologies, and how they integrate in the way that we enjoy everyday life and smart cities. That's my 2 cents on this. We are tagging along BOMAC Talk Virtual Tailgate on Technology Management. If you would like to continue this discussion one-on-one, connect via chat, video, or email, you can do so from our website. Self-schedule an appointment at our website, www.urbanetek2.com. Select a day and a time for us to have a conversation about your specific management needs in this area.